starting.
Good evening.
You have the mic?
I guess I should be from here.
Yeah.
I don't need it. Well, good. Okay.
I do.
Yes, he does. you need the
I
mic
do
for the
need it.
for the
Oh, I
for
do
the
need it.
streaming.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, here we are. My name is Joseph Loscalvo. I'm the president and CEO of the SDG Music Foundation. And I want to welcome our audience here at the PianoForte studios, the few, the brave, who have braved the vicissitudes of the Chicago weather to get here. And I especially want to welcome any of you who are participating via YouTube. And the only thing that I'm going to do other than that is to introduce our moderator, Dr. Johann Buis, who is an associate professor of musicology at the Wheaton College Conservatory of Music. He is also both the chairperson of the governing board of the SDG Music Foundation and also of our artistic board. And for those of you who are participating via YouTube, there is a chat feature on the YouTube screen. So when we get to the question and answer portion of the program, please feel free to submit your questions through the chat, and I will relay them. I promise at that time to be actually near the microphone, and I will relay them to Johann. So without further ado, I turn the evening over to Johann Buis. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this very, very significant event. I call it significant because for much of the more recent time, we find that audiences are craving more than just the concert experience. And so there is value added in preliminary events that highlight an event that will come up. So tonight is our first of two events. Next Monday in the PianoForte studios, the same place here, we will be talking about the performer's perspectives of performing the B minor Mass. In that time, we will also be able to have in our presence via Skype Professor Marcus Rattay of the Yale Institute for Sacred Music, who has just written a book on the music of Bach, and he worked at the Bach archive. But today we are looking at the B minor Mass in various ways. We have with us Professor Mark Peters, who will lead us off on the question of the B minor Mass, or as Bach calls it, the Mass in B minor, in context. And what is the historical background, and what are the features that make this such a monumental and beloved work? Then Professor Marty will join us in reflecting on the question of the B minor Mass and what are its liturgical conundrums or interesting features, and is it a liturgical work in one sense or another? We are waiting on Professor Jesse Rosenberg, who has alerted us that he is delayed, but when he comes, we would like him to look at this work that he has thought of and written on for a long time and give us the Jewish perspective to the B minor Mass, or a Jewish perspective on the B minor Mass. And I think that we would all find that when we go to the concert, which is on Friday, the 11th of March at the Harris Theatre, and be sure to alert your friends and relatives to that. But you're all welcome to come to that performance with John Nelson conducting the Chicago Bach Choir and Orchestra for the monumental 1.5 hour work called the B minor Mass. Now, without further ado, let me introduce Professor Mark Peters to you. He comes to us from Trinity Christian College, where he is professor of musicology there and head of the music department. He has a book on Bach and the Magnificat, and he concerns himself with the questions surrounding the Marian feast days in the works of Bach and so on. But he's also a past member of the board of the American Bach Society, and so a scholar on Bach himself. Dr. Peters, welcome.
Thank you, Johann. Thank you all for being here today. I have 5 broad categories that I'd like to introduce in terms of contexts for thinking about Bach and the B minor Mass, and I'd like to just briefly introduce each one, and I thought we could come back to any that are of particular interest in the question time. So very briefly, I wanted to start with the idea of reception. In 1818, Hans-Georg Nägeli labeled the B minor Mass as, quote, the greatest musical artwork of all times and nations, unquote. This was before the B minor Mass had ever been performed in its entirety. He was trying to sell subscriptions to a publication, so there's an advertising aspect to that, but it is significant that he labels it as the greatest musical artwork of all times and nations. And of course, it's significant to us today and here because it's still considered one of the greatest works in Western classical music, and that's why it's being performed in Chicago by the Chicago Bach Project, and that there will be significant interest in this because of the great interest and its historical context, but also it's just wonderful music. So in terms of reception, it's something that's still very important to us and recognized as a great artwork in the Western classical tradition. My second category I will also treat just very briefly because this is Professor Marty's area that he's going to address, that of liturgical context. So I just wanted to highlight there that when Bach is thinking about a Mass, he's thinking about a liturgical work. So this is church music. This is not music for the concert hall. He's thinking of it in terms of a larger liturgy. So about 70 times a year in Bach's Leipzig, these texts would be heard in some form. So we have the texts of the Mass Ordinary, these 5 sections, and these are texts that would have been well known by congregants. They would be recognized in either German or in Latin, but they would be performed as liturgical elements within the Mass on every Sunday and feast day throughout the liturgical year. So again, well-known texts and texts that would have fit in with a larger liturgical context, and I'll look forward to what Professor Marty says more about that. A third category, and this I'll treat in a bit more detail, is the idea of compositional history. So here I want to talk about genre, so what kind of piece it is, what kind of piece a Mass is in Bach's time, but also where that fits within Bach's own life and his compositional career. So for Bach, there would have been 3 types of Mass settings. Generally, there would have been Mass settings in either German or in Latin. German works would have been congregational song. These are settings of the texts of the sections of the Mass Ordinary that were designed as hymns for the congregation to sing. And this is the normal way that these sections, the Creed, the Gloria, the Kyrie, etc., would have been performed in the liturgy each week. So the congregations would best know these texts in their German versions as hymns to be sung by the congregation. They would also, however, know the Latin versions, and the Latin version might be done in what was known as a missa brevis, which would be just one movement for each section, so a Kyrie in one movement, a Gloria in one movement, etc., or as what later became known as a missa solemnis, where you would have the different sections in multiple movements. So, and this is the kind of Mass that we have in Bach's B minor Mass, so that we have 3 movements of a Kyrie, multiple movements for the Gloria, etc. So again, the normal version is congregational song. So this type of piece that Bach was writing is a special type of piece. And it's even more special for Bach because this is the only such composition that he ever wrote. So he only wrote 1 setting of the Mass Ordinary that was complete and in Latin in this form. He did compose some additional settings of individual movements of the Mass. He composed 4 settings known as the Lutheran Masses of just the Kyrie and the Gloria, but this is his only setting of the complete Mass Ordinary. In terms of where it fits in Bach's life and compositional career, this is in Leipzig. So we know Bach best in Leipzig, where he arrived in 1723 as cantor and remained there until he died in 1750. Now, Bach's early years in Leipzig, he was focused compositionally on cantatas and on passions. So most of Bach's cantatas were written during his first few years in Leipzig. Also, the first versions of both the St. John Passion and the St. Matthew Passion. These are Bach's first years in Leipzig, focused on these liturgical works in German and for the regular liturgy, both the Sunday and feast day liturgy, and then the Passions for the Good Friday liturgy each year. So that's 1723. In 1729, Bach is appointed to an additional post as director of the Collegium Musicum for the University of Leipzig, and that gave him a chance to perform more music outside of the church and outside of the liturgy. So he turned his focus then compositionally more to music that was for music outside the church and also to instrumental music, and less on cantatas and passions for a time at least. In the 1730s, which is the time when he really begins what we know now as the B minor Mass, he did focus on large-scale compositions for the church. This is the period of the Magnificat, of the first two movements of what became the B minor Mass, and also the time of the Christmas Oratorio. So he was focusing on these large-scale works for the church, and the Kyrie and the Gloria of the Mass fit within that context in the 1730s. So in 1733 is the year that we have for what Bach called the Missa, which is the Kyrie, which is today known as the Kyrie and the Gloria of the B minor Mass. And he wrote this with a specific goal in mind, and this is to achieve a court title. So he dedicated it to the Elector of Saxony, Friedrich August II, dated July 27, 1733, accompanied by a letter requesting a court position, and really requesting a court title would be a better way to say it. And what he eventually received this title 3 years later when they finally got around to it, bureaucracy, you know. So when he achieves this title, the idea of this is that there are no specific requirements of the title. It's not like he's getting paid for this or receiving a position or employment in that way. But what it does, it gives him the title of court composer, so he can go back to the officials in Leipzig and say, I have this title, and you should respect me more in my work here. So that was his goal in composing and dedicating this initial section of the B minor Mass, was to gain this honorary title in Dresden. Now, this is especially interesting because the Dresden court was Roman Catholic. The Elector of Saxony was also the King of Poland, and so this is a Roman Catholic court. And in composing a piece that is in Latin and setting the Mass Ordinary, Bach is providing texts and providing a text kind of music that could be performed in Dresden, could be performed at the court chapel, but could also be performed back in Leipzig for the Lutheran liturgy. So this is a kind of music that had a flexibility to it. Recent scholars have also shown the ways that Bach was writing the piece specifically for Dresden, the Kyrie and the Gloria, that he knew what Dresden composers were doing in their composition of Kyries and Kyrie-Gloria pairs, so that the length, the style, specific aspects of that fit very closely with what composers in Dresden were doing at the time. We don't have evidence of performance. It's possible that the work was performed at the Sophiankirche in Dresden, where Bach's son, Wilhelm Friedemann Bach, had recently been appointed as organist, but we don't know that for sure. So we don't know if it was ever performed in 1733 or not. Bach then returned to the B minor Mass and completed what we know as the B minor Mass very late in his life. It was completed in 1748 and 49, so right before he died in 1750, one of his last projects. However, through a process that we call parody, Bach borrowed a lot of movements from earlier in his compositional career. So that 13 of the 27 movements in the B minor Mass are actually based on earlier compositions. So he would take a cantata movement, give it a new text, alter the music to fit in a new context, and give it a more permanent home within the B minor Mass. So the actual compositional scope of the B minor Mass, the earliest piece that we know of, is from 1724. So it's really a 25-year scope of composition for this work, covering really basically Bach's entire time in Leipzig. A next category, and this I'll treat again just briefly, a big question that people raise in relation to the B minor Mass is that of performance. So there is no performance that we know of during Bach's lifetime, and people speak of this as something that would not have been practical. It's such a long composition in terms of the Mass Ordinary and how that fits within the larger liturgy. So how could that have been performed? Was Bach even thinking of performance when he composed this work? And I argue that he was. I believe it would have been inconceivable for Bach or for any of his contemporaries to write a piece of music that they weren't thinking about for performance. So I believe Bach was thinking of performance for this work, and I do believe that he was thinking of performance for the liturgy, so performance within a church service. So the idea of composing a Mass for a concert performance, we know famously now, for example, from Beethoven's Missa Solemnis, Beethoven's not thinking of a church service for that performance, he's thinking of the concert hall. But again, that's a 19th century conception, it's not a conception during Bach's time. So I do believe that Bach was thinking of this in terms of the liturgy. One argument against this is that it is such a long piece. How could it have practically fit within the liturgy? But I think this idea of length we're also thinking of in modern terms. So, for example, the regular church service in Bach's Leipzig was 3 hours long, a very different conception of time than we would think of. The sermon is an hour long, which is much too long for us to think of today in terms of the length and fitting something within the liturgy. Also, I think of the example of the St. Matthew Passion. The St. Matthew Passion is also much too long for the liturgy, at about 2.5 hours long, but we know that Bach performed it within the liturgy and that he composed it specifically for that. So the fact that the B minor Mass is about 1.5 hours long, I don't think it would have been a hindrance to it being performed in Leipzig. That's something we could discuss further, though, as well. Finally, I want to think of this in terms of the Mass as a compositional collection, and this is something that we see Bach very interested in, especially in the final decades of his life, is creating collections of composition. And the B minor Mass can be seen in the same way as a collected composition. Bach seems to have had a much stronger interest in preserving his music for future generations than did his contemporaries. He seemed very interested in the idea of a musical legacy, of passing on music to a future generation, and of creating exemplary models of particular compositions. So, for example, Bach composed one Magnificat, which he did in 2 versions. He composed one Matthew Passion. He composed one John Passion. He composed relatively few cantatas in relation to what his colleagues, his other composers of the time were doing. So Telemann, for example, composed over 50 settings of passions. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but he composed over 50 passions. Telemann composed over 1,000 cantatas compared with Bach's 200. So Bach seems to have been very, very interested in perfecting small numbers of works rather than composing a lot of works. The broader context for this is that a lot of this church music, so as Telemann's writing, this music would have been considered to be ephemeral. So you compose something for the second Sunday after Easter, and you compose it for this particular year, and you never perform it again. Whereas Bach was more interested in saying, I'll compose it this year for the second Sunday of Easter, but then I might perform it again in 5 years, the same composition, and then I might come back and put it in the B minor Mass and save it for a future generation in a more universal form as well. So this brings us back to the idea of parody, and again, something that's important for the B minor Mass is that Bach is borrowing from his earlier compositions and preserving those works in a more lasting form. So whereas the cantata especially would have been seen as a more ephemeral genre, something that would not have lasted, the Mass would have been seen as a more lasting genre. So because it was in Latin, it could be used in both Lutheran and Roman Catholic settings. Also, because it was a Mass and not an occasional work like a cantata, it's something that could be performed, again, about 70 times a year, and that could be performed in many, many places that many times a year as well. So in closing, if we could play just a few tracks so we can get the sound of some of these different kinds of works in our ears. In thinking about this as a collection of works, we can also see in this many different compositional styles, many different combinations of voices and instruments, from solo voice up to 8 vocal parts. We see newly composed works side by side with parody works of earlier compositions. So again, a wide variety of styles, and we'll just hear a few of those so we can get those in our ears as we go. So we'll start with the second movement, which is the Christe eleison, and this is very much in a modern style. So this would have been the newest compositional style in which composers were writing at the time. So for solo voice. Again, in a very modern style. So again, a very modern style of vocal writing and instrumental accompaniment as well. Now, that's followed immediately by what would have been considered a very old style. And here we have 5 voice parts and imitative textures, very complex vocal writing that Bach's contemporaries would have recognized as an intentional evoking of an old style. So this is the second Kyrie, the third movement of the Mass. We'll listen just briefly then to two other choral movements. First, a newly composed choral movement. So this is something Bach is writing, in this case, for 1733. As part of the Gloria, this is the second portion of the Gloria, the Et in Terra Pax. And then finally, we'll listen to a parody movement. So this is probably recognized as one of the best known movements in the B minor Mass. Bach actually uses this music twice. So we'll listen to it as movement 7, the Gratias Agimus Tibi, but it comes back as the final movement of the Mass as well, the Dona Nobis Pacem, Grant Us Peace. And this is a parody movement. Bach borrows this from an earlier composition, actually a cantata for the installation of the town council. So this is one of those, you have the newly elected town officials, and there's a ceremony kind of installing them, and Bach composes a cantata for that. Now, once he's done that once, he can't use that music again for a cantata, so he takes that and puts it in the B minor Mass, a place where it can be heard and continue to have a life, a compositional life after that, that is more permanent. So this is the movement 7, Gratias Agimus Tibi. And if we have time, maybe we can listen to a few things later, but that hopefully gives us a good introduction to that. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd like to invite Dr. Jesse Rosenberg to join us at the table here. Welcome. Welcome. Good. Now, we'll turn to the Mass in B minor and questions regarding the liturgy and liturgical questions that Professor Martin Marty will explicate for us.
I think I would call my words the politics of liturgy, because he really has dealt very well with the innards of liturgy. I read the advertisement for this event, and it really stressed what a strange idea that this central Catholic concept of a Mass is written by the greatest Protestant and Lutheran composer ever. How do you fit these two together? Well, when I grew up, I'm a Lutheran, it kind of shows. When I grew up, you wouldn't have dreamed of using the word Mass in a Lutheran service. You wouldn't have used the word Catholic. Now we say one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Our own parish, you spoke there, did this B minor Mass, and we called it the Great Catholic Mass. So something happened. Pope John the 23rd and a few other things happened along the way. But at the time, until then, it was very, very distant notion. And I'm just going to ask how this comes together. Liturgy comes from liturgia. It means it's the people's service. Who are the people who make this up? Well, I thought it'd be real confrontational and get it out on the table. It's not a new idea. The official confession of the Lutheran Church was the Augsburg of 1530, followed by an apologia for it. And I'm just going to quote 5 lines from each to let you show that they weren't ducking it, and Bach was not in some strange corner of the thing, but he, as a Protestant, as a Lutheran, as an evangelical, did a Mass. Augsburg Confession, quote, "Our churches are falsely accused of abolishing the Mass. Actually, the Mass is retained among us and is celebrated with the greatest reverence. Almost all the customary ceremonies are also retained, except the German hymns are interspersed here and there among the parts sung in Latin." And then when they had to make an apologia explaining this thing, they came back again and saying, "We do not abolish the Mass, but we religiously keep and defend it. In our churches, the Mass is celebrated every Sunday and on other festivals when the sacrament is offered to those who wish for it after they've been examined and absolved. We keep traditional liturgical forms, such as the order of the lessons, prayers, vestments, etc." So it was a conservative Reformation. They weren't out to make a great change along the way. Why make a fuss over the fact that Bach and the Bachians called it the Great Catholic Mass? Why care about the Lutheran Catholic interplay of centuries ago? After all, we don't live there. We're focusing on a work of art and, for many, an act of worship. But it's not something you do didactically. I was in a liturgical course way back, late Middle Ages, and we had a professor who really always railed against the notion that you don't take a doctrine and set it to music, dogmatic set to music. So he would give examples. It's just us Highlands, second verse, second line, good works could not avert our doom. Good works. We made one word out of that to make that thing fit in there. That was dogmatic set to music, and it was really horrible that way, which Bach redeemed in a very wonderful setting of that hymn later on. Well, why do we care? Number one, we care because the historic understanding of what went into this Mass gives a great understanding of it when we listen to it. Secondly, because we learn the artistic context of it. Mass faded in Protestantism and Lutheran setting, but it's becoming unfaded now. I like to chronicle as a Chicago and all the ways in which this interplays, because it's a very Catholic city with a lot of Lutherans in it. And in our parish, there are a lot of Lutheran Catholic or Catholic Lutheran marriages. And I was in a class once where somebody said, you were the bride and now you're in this Lutheran church. What's different? What'd you tell you? Oh, the Lutherans, they sing every verse of every hymn. She was used to guitar and a little bit in today's Catholic Mass. Well, let's come back. Why make a fuss? Partly, you have to do some retrieving for demographic reasons. For example, think of the bizarre character from what we know of the modern Poland and the modern Germany, or at least Saxony. Poland, very, very Catholic, and Saxony, where the Lutheran and Protestant Reformation on the continent was born. And they have Karl Augustus III ruling over both. Now, you want to be a musician for them, and in the court, Bach was very and you could go country after country, just as in Catholicism, the Pope and is Latin American, and yet that world is changing. You have two options. You can mix them and muddle them. I mentioned a conversation before that I was speaking at a youth interfaith gathering one time. There were 35 young leaders there, and the whole spectrum from Wheaton College evangelicals to Unitarian Universalists. And I asked all of them, would you write on a piece of paper when we start, if your fellow Wheatonites are nervous about your being here, or your Unitarians are nervous about you being here, what's the big worry? The big worry on all 35 was that we'll turn wishy-washy, that you lose the heart of the faith along the way. Well, this was a group run by Ibu Patel, who knows what's going on here. And when his group meets with high schoolers, they'll say, how does your faith community read a text? Well, Mom, we're Presbyterian. How do we read a text? We're Reformed Jews. How do we read a text? What does your faith say about what's done? When they go home, they are more aware of who they are and what they believe. With Bach, he went all the way in everything along the way. When you get to the parodies, that was a funny word to use here, he brings something back. These are often almost primevally out of the German and Lutheran tradition, and yet of the Western world. I was once on a program at Oregon Bach Festival, and a physicist in the audience had the idea. My daughter came home, I'm a physicist, and I was talking about how big the universe is. And she said, how big is the universe? Real big. Well, you get that as you listen to Bach. This B minor is real big along the way. And we learn some new things about religion. But we're going to be hearing very soon a Jewish interpretation of this. It's exactly fitting when Bach is coming back. Well, there are all kinds of Jewish imagery in there, and then you have the central Christian theme along the way. Father Paul Coutier, a great Dominican, once said, I trust genius no matter from what faith it comes. And that's a big part, and Bach fit into that. So we have before us the Great Catholic Mass by a Lutheran. Mixing and blending, yes, they're both there, and yet you're on home soil along the way, and I'm extremely interested in looking forward to a Jewish understanding of this, as Catholics and Protestants are getting ever more aware of the roots in Jewish worship, liturgy, of their own things along the way. I used the word story before. I think what gives interfaith passion and power is if it's in the story. I don't want to go to a Presbyterian church that doesn't know anything about Calvinism. I don't want to go to Jewish worship that doesn't know the deep rootage in the prophets and all that. But Bach was able to work all that in the, not in the ordinary, but in the propers. That's why the great stress was this. I think that art and music are making it more possible for more people to understand each other along the way. Next fall, not this fall, 2017, is the 500th anniversary of Luther's 95 Theses. And all over the Lutheran Catholic world and the Protestant world, you're going to hear an awful lot about it. I fortunately, for myself, retired from travel. I don't like to travel anymore. But boy, have I got nice letters, when I come to a week at the University of Kansas and do this. Everybody's going to do it. Why? We're trying to retrace our steps and figure out exactly what was going on in that. In 1999, the Vatican and the Lutheran World Federation, these are not marginal groups, came together in a great statement about the central teaching over which they fought 500 years ago. And I think that much of that was made possible by the fact that we've heard each other's music and we've met on the terms of genius and of art. And that was Bach's great gift, that he could take the liturgia, the work of the people, and transform it into this great, great work along the way. I'd like to hear what's coming up from Jewish interpretation now.
Thank you so very much, Professor Martin. Good. Welcome, Professor Jesse Rosenberg. We anticipate your coming, and so thank you for giving us your contribution.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me all? Okay.
Yeah.
There is one B minor Mass excerpt, which I'll get to in a little while on
I'll
that
put
flash
it
drive.
in.
Thank
Okay,
you so
good.
much.
Okay, no problem.
So sorry to be arriving late to the table, literally. And so sorry to have missed most of this first presentation. Just the tail end of it that I caught seemed extremely interesting. And very grateful to Professor Marty for his comments. Although he quasi-announced me as someone who is going to be offering a Jewish interpretation, I think maybe what I have to offer is a bit more individual than anything I would put forward as a Jewish interpretation. But I was very glad to catch this reference to Chagall. Chagall is a famous Jewish artist. And this famous work of art, which is now returning to the Art Institute of Chicago, I was just turning through the pages of this, and I was very much struck by this. I think it was the day before yesterday. There was a crucifixion scene by Chagall. Now, if Chagall is a famous artist coming from Eastern Europe, very much immersed in that whole world of Eastern European Judaism and Jewish folklore, Jewish figures floating, literally floating all around his paintings, then why does he paint a crucifix? And it's an extremely interesting explanation, what's put forward in that description, which is that it has to do with suffering. And Jews know how to identify with suffering. There is something quite universal in that idea, not at all specific to any one faith tradition. And you may not know this, but there's actually a very interesting musical counterpart to that in the person of another famous Jewish creative artist, Ernest Bloch, Swiss musician who spent most of his career in the United States. By the early 20th century, by 1915 or so, he was pretty much considered Mr. Jewish music because of a whole series of works that he brought before the public, inspired by Jewish ideas, Jewish themes. And many visitors to his home were amazed to see that the first thing they came across was a crucifix, which he carried around with him quite faithfully all his life and defended. and described it in exactly the same terms in which Chagall saw it and defended it, as an important symbol of suffering as a universal human condition. So, just wanted to get that out there. Recently, in sorting through my own feelings about this stupendous work, the B minor Mass, I thought back to the first recording of the work that I had listened to as a teenager. Only just in the last couple of weeks, in thinking about this event, something occurred to me which I hadn't really thought about before, namely that recorded performance was conducted by Otto Klemperer, a Jewish musician who was kicked out of his job at the Kroll Opera House in Berlin following the advent of Nazi power in Germany. There's an interesting, important footnote to that fact. Klemperer had actually converted to Catholicism in 1919, but naturally that conversion meant nothing to the Nazis, who saw Jewishness as a purely racial affair, something in the blood. So that religious belief, religious practice were completely beside the point. And then to further complicate the issue, I consulted a biography of Klemperer and discovered that he had reconverted to Judaism and taken on Israeli citizenship right before his death. This led me to consider other Jewish musicians who have been involved in the B minor Mass, and I can mention a couple of other significant recordings of this work that I've gone back to recently. One of them I got to know in graduate school. It's conducted by Sir Georg Scholti, who was also Jewish, but never converted. And the other was by a New York-based musician who is still alive and keeping busy, Joshua Rifkin. He directed a number of performances and also a recording by an outfit called the Bach Ensemble. That's the version of the B minor Mass that in graduate school we used to jokingly refer to as the B minor madrigal, because there was no chorus. According to the researches of Rifkin, it is supposed to be sung by solo voices. So the only singers who have anything to do with this are the solo voices. And in the choral numbers, it's just the solo voices joining together. I don't endorse that at all. I was never convinced by the various arguments he adduced. And I realize he tried hard to demonstrate that this was the right way to do it, but I found the musical results bizarre and, for other reasons, also very disturbing that I'll get into in a moment. I mention it in this context just because this is yet another Jewish conductor who is evidently drawn to the B minor Mass, along with many other sacred works by Bach. I'm almost finished with this quick survey of Jewish musicians associated with Bach's music for the Christian Church. Last year, I was teaching a music history course at Northwestern University. I was dealing with the 18th century and wanted to show my students some of the ways in which the performance of Baroque music has changed over the last century. And one of the recordings I played was this one from 1929. Do you have the... That's an excerpt from the first complete recording of the B minor Mass from 1929, conducted by Albert Coates with the London Symphony Orchestra. And as for the singer, you may have guessed it, this wonderful baritone on that recording was Jewish, a very successful bass baritone of the time named Friedrich Schor, son of a cantor, much acclaimed, believe it or not, in Wagnerian roles, especially Wotan and Hans Sachs. But what occurred to me this past month listening to that again was that the particular text of this magnificent aria was from the credo section of the Mass, the very part which one might imagine would cause a certain amount of awkwardness or embarrassment for a Jewish musician with that strong Trinitarian focus. And in the particular text for this aria, a specific reference to the third person of the Trinity. What is going on in these examples of Jewish musicians who perform, who participate, and who are drawn to this work? Is it simply that the music is beautiful, and that therefore it's the music which ultimately counts, the words being secondary or irrelevant? I doubt that very much. And a quick glance at one final Jewish musician I'll talk about, Leonard Bernstein, is enough for me to rule that interpretation out completely. In 1957, in one of his scripts for the Omnibus television series, he devoted an entire program to Bach. And in this program, Bernstein lavishes praise, more praise on Bach and his sacred music than he ever lavished on anyone else or anything else. But he doesn't do that at all by marginalizing the Christian text. On the contrary, he delves into the Christian imagery, the gospel references, in great detail. Evidently, he saw them as essential to any genuine understanding of or appreciation for Bach's sacred music because of the intimate relation that music had with the ideas which inspired it. To Bernstein, the two simply could not be separated. I would like to move on to some rather personal observations on what I think everyone, Christians and Jews and everyone else, really ought to be able to relate to in the B minor Mass. I'd like to return first to something that I touched on earlier when I was criticizing the Joshua Rifkin recording. To me, the alternation of choral numbers with solo numbers is absolutely essential. I could say that from a musical point of view, it is part of the variety, this stupendous, universal, all-encompassing quality of this work, which has modern styles and archaic styles, which has very intimate numbers and massive, imposing numbers. But I also think that there is a religious meaning embedded within that very alternation of vocal textures. Seems to me rather obvious that the choral textures represent the collectivity. The solo arias and the duets represent individuals. Both are essential, and maybe even more to the point, there's a kind of mutual dependency there. Those two things need each other in order to make sense. To adhere to a faith is to be part of a community, is to be in fellowship. That is essential. Any statement of faith has to allow for that. And at the same time, if it is only a matter of being part of some collectivity, if it's not also verified through individual experience, then it's empty. It's hollow. To me, the most grievous fault of a performance of the B minor Mass that has only solo vocal parts without any large chorus isn't so much that it is a musical travesty, but it's a religious travesty. It does a kind of violence to an idea of very fundamental religious import that I think all of us can relate to. And then I am thinking of some words that I heard spoken by John Nelson when we had a similar event to this last year. And speaking off the cuff, going on a bit of a tangent, he mentioned that he had been at a religious service not long ago, and he was appalled by it. He found it banal, he found it trite. There was no heart, no soul, no seriousness in the music heard and sung at this particular church service. This is something else that I think we can all get from the B minor Mass. The idea that when you're consecrating music to God, it's serious. There is nothing casual about it. There is nothing necessarily fun about it. It requires concentration, it requires attention, and an attitude of reverence. Then, this is such a strange composition, and again, I'm so sorry I missed the first presentation on this, because to me, one of the most astonishing things about this composition is that, in a sense, it's not a composition. Which is to say, Bach never planned for any complete performance of the B minor Mass. We know that it has a very long, complicated history. The earliest music that he wrote, which ended up in the crucifix section, started off as part of that cantata Bienen Klagen. I'm sure you mentioned that. That's an early cantata that goes back to Bach's period in Weimar. And then the last parts of the music that he's composing are in the late 1840s. So we've got a compositional genesis of this work that extends for more than 30 years. And yet, he is putting together, at the very end of his life, a complete Mass which is never going to be performed. He doesn't even have the idea, the plan for a performance. It certainly isn't going to be done as part of a Roman Catholic Church service. It's way too big to work liturgically in that sort of context. It almost goes against the very definition of the word composition, which is something that you create in order for it to be performed, heard, experienced at a particular time and place. Virtually every other composition that we talk about using that term meets that definition. Why would Bach write a work that no one was ever going to hear? Write it without even the notion that a performance might come of it. I'm reminded of something that I heard when I visited the cathedral in Orvieto, very beautiful medieval town in central Italy. And someone who lived there was showing me around the cathedral, incredible frescoes and sculptures and so on, and then pointed to very, very high up in one of the side chapels and said to me, "Do you know that there is a painting up there which no one has ever seen, unless you can climb up scaffolding or a great big ladder or something like that?" And I said to this person, why would they put the painting there? Why would a painting be placed in a place where no one was ever going to see it? And the person answered, God will see it. God knows it's there. And that's what counts. Now, this organization sponsoring this event, Soli Deo Gloria, is named after something which I think you may all know, that Bach wrote these Latin words, "For the glory of God alone," at the end of a great many of his compositions, including, by the way, the B minor Mass. The very end, last page of the B minor Mass has that. Well, I guess we can say that that makes perfect sense for a sacred work. Of course, a sacred work intended for the glory of God. It's not as well known that Bach also wrote those same Latin words at the conclusion of many secular works. It was not only religious music that deserved that kind of motto. This particular case of the B minor Mass seems to have a way of taking that idea to a completely new level. He really is assembling from all these disparate sources, all these different periods of his creative career, this gigantic, highly variegated work, not because he has any notion that anyone will be listening to it as a work, as a composition, He is doing it, and it's enough that he knows that he's doing it, and God knows he's doing it. Soli Deo Gloria. Thank you very much.
Before we open the floor, this is one of those wonderful things that panel discussions always engender, and that is that some of us have views that differ. I am very much, and I should disclose this, as a non-Bach scholar myself, and I'm in the camp with Professor Rosenberg until my colleague, who is a Bach scholar, the Professor Peters, commented on the fact that this work has context in the worship service. Would you like to expand on this point further?
Sure. Yeah. So so we're just meeting, and I'm disagreeing with you. So it's good to meet you. Okay. Right. Yes. Okay. Yes. So earlier in my talk, I argued that Bach would have been thinking of performance, that it was inconceivable for a Baroque composer in the 18th century to be writing something that he wasn't thinking of having as possible performance. And we don't know that the Missa of 1733 was actually performed, but we do know in terms of the number of movements, in terms of the length, even the scoring for 5 voices instead of 4. These were all common for Dresden masses at the time. So the length of the Kyrie and Gloria is exactly in keeping with what other composers were doing and performing in Dresden at that time. So of course, it wasn't performed during Bach's lifetime, but I have to think that he was thinking of possible performance. I also brought up the example of the Matthew Passion, which is way too long for performance, but of course Bach performed it and is performed within the liturgy as well. So of course it wasn't performed, but I do believe he was thinking toward performance with this. But I appreciate your perspective on that.
Okay,
as well.
so we certainly have lots of association with performance with this Mass. We know that the Sanctus was actually performed in an earlier version for a Christmas service back in 1724. As for the Kyrie and the Gloria that he actually presented to the King of Saxony in 1733, I think, I'm sure that the intention there was for it to be performed, because it would be precisely by making a good impression by such a performance that he would be able to land a job in Dresden, which would have been probably a lot more prestigious and a considerable increase in salary over what he was getting teaching little boys Latin and working every day very hard at the Thomaskirche in Leipzig. With regard to the Mass as an entirety, I'm not really sure that we can assume that he wouldn't have written it unless he expected a performance, unless he were planning a performance. And I guess I'm thinking of other works by Bach, which I'm quite certain were never intended for performance. One of them is the Art of the Fugue, which does not indicate any instruments. He doesn't say that they're for voices to perform, doesn't indicate violins, flutes, anything. The idea simply seems to be a kind of demonstration of what he was able to do, all the many different kinds of fugal forms and techniques he was able to bring to a magnum opus like that. There's a similar case, actually, with another very technical, show-offy kind of work, the musical offering, that he dedicates to Frederick the Great, King of Prussia. Now, the musical offering does have certain pieces which are performed and which are actually quite beautiful, thinking especially of the trio sonata, but also the Ricercare that was orchestrated by Webern and so on. And yet there are a whole bunch of canons, puzzle canons, absolutely bizarre puzzle canons. It takes a long time to figure out how they might work, how to solve the puzzle. And some of these actually have been recorded. People are curious. It's by Bach, after all. How bad can it be? And I've heard these things. And if anything, it reinforces my notion that he really was not intending for this to be heard. They were not aesthetic. These are not musical compositions in the sense of things that we listen to and say, that made a certain aesthetic impression on me. I see them as purely a demonstration of something. And the fact is that this sort of music that Bach wrote not with the idea of performance, was very important to him. We know this because of the one authenticated portrait of Bach which has survived, There are actually two very similar versions of this portrait. One is in Princeton University, and I think the other is in Leipzig. I'm not sure where the other one is. Bach does what many musicians do, many illustrious people do, when they sit for portraits. He holds something which symbolizes him, which typifies the kind of person he is, the kind of contribution he's made. And what he has in his hand is actually a small manuscript of one of these puzzle canons. It's written out as a single line. I believe it consists of two measures. It's what they call an infinite canon, meaning that once you start it, strictly speaking, you have to keep playing it for the rest of your life. No voices indicated, no instruments indicated. This too has been recorded. I heard a recording once, and I just can't conceive that Bach really wanted us to listen to this thing. So I don't put this forth as any kind of definitive refutation of your position, and I would not dare to quibble with a Bach scholar. I'm very, very far from being a Bach scholar. But there are other ways of approaching the issue, so maybe we can continue the conversation.
We'll keep that in suspense for us to ponder. We'd like to welcome questions both from our online community, and be sure to use your chat feature and send in your questions, but also audience members, you feel free to raise questions.
Mr. Rosenberg, I'd like you to comment on how the music translates the text more profoundly than perhaps any other setting of the Mass.
So the question is, how does music translate
How
the
does
text?
This
This music translates the
of
text
Mass?
more so than any other setting of the Mass.
And because you certainly have said that, and I certainly agree that that is the case, but would you care to comment on that?
Does the music translate the text better than any other composition? To me, that seems a trifle hyperbolic. I share your passionate enthusiasm and admiration for this work. I'm not sure I would go quite so far as to say it surpasses anything along those lines. And I think we need to take very seriously what was said earlier about the parodies. And I'm not sure you quite, or it was clear to everyone, the idea that Bach wrote music and then took the earlier music and adapted it for other forces, for other purposes. He did this throughout his life. It was actually a very common thing to do in the Baroque period. We have similar cases with Handel and Vivaldi and so on. Let's take the Crucifixus. I suppose we could listen to the Crucifixus and say that it is a perfect musical translation of that word of the Credo. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. But the fact is that he wrote that music for other words. Now, I'm not saying that's irrelevant. I'm not saying that the other words have nothing to do with the crucifixes. In fact, there's quite a large area of confluence there. That early cantata of his is basically dedicated to the idea that we need to suffer in order to find salvation. And that has everything to do with the crucifixus, that connection between the suffering and the salvation that comes out of it, that flows out of it and results from it. So I guess I would hesitate to generalize about the music of the Mass as a perfect translation, because there are so many cases, and so many of them are anomalous. That is, so many of them have textual origins which are different from the text we end up with at that corresponding point of the music in the B minor Mass. Maybe I can defer also to a Bach expert. Yes.
Yeah, go ahead. You want to comment? Okay, go ahead.
No, I agree that Bach is kind of crafting music as appropriate for text, and Bach is a master of doing this, and certainly other composers are masters of doing this as well. And certainly in the Baroque period, it's very important, the matching of text with musical figures, sometimes more literally, sometimes more figuratively. And Bach is very careful to do that in the B minor Mass. And when he's using models, that he's choosing models that fit in some way. And then also he's not just using the same exact music he had before, but he's adapting it to fit the new context as well. So he's treating it very carefully, and I think it's certainly a superb example of crafting music to reflect text.
Any other questions? Yes.
I'd ask the senior member of the panel, Professor Marty, as you have listened to some of us just listen to beautiful music. I appreciate all your comments, but basically I think it's a beautiful piece of music. As you've listened to it perhaps longer than any of the rest of us, how have you seen modern composers, and how has it changed from maybe the first time you listened to it to what we might expect to see from John Nelson Friday night?
I have to repeat the question. The question is to Professor Marty, how have you seen the work change over your life of hearing this work?
My father was a church organist in a little town in Nebraska, and I don't think they even had a concept that you could do something like the B minor, and yet we were just glued to the radio every week. Walter Jamrosh, and I mean, we didn't miss anything of that sort. I went to a Lutheran preparatory school in the 40s, though, and I sang in it in the Milwaukee a cappella. So I got a good early round at it there. And what was interesting there, these were volunteer choirs. These were Milwaukee people that had other jobs and things, and various, the soloists, of course, were first rate along the way. But I don't think they were ready yet to see how broad the kind of audiences might be. We talked a little bit about Jews in the audiences. My wife and I often, when we're in another city, we look at the list of the donors to things like music of the Baroque, and here it's all less. Very many names are obviously of Jewish people. We couldn't get along without them along the way. And then how did they bring it in? Well, I think that. I'll give one sample. The first violinist of the Weimar String Quartet, Shmuel Ashkenazi. Every year he's playing this 7 Last Words of Christ, and it's all, you can't get more central. Bach would have loved them. How central they are. Suffering, Christ's suffering, it's all along the way. And somebody asked him, Mr. Ashkenazi, you're a Jew, and here there's a central of the Christian faith. How could you do that? He said, I have so much respect for Haydn's music that if that's what he wanted, that's what I want. And that's what I was trying to say, though, by the character of the work of the art itself is such that it carries you into a whole new category. So I think I would say that even in the Milwaukee a cappella, your audience was pretty much only believing Christians, and they were just affirming what they knew. Now you're transforming it into a different thing, just like Chagall's White Crucifixion, which I hope you'll all check when it's opening at the Art Institute. You can't get closer to what the Christian story is. It's Jesus suffering. And some of his images have all the central things of Christ. I don't think that was even conceived of in the 1940s and 50s when we first started hearing it. It's become much more nearly universal. The sad other side of it, though, is that there are huge parts of the culture for whom it's a forgotten language, and you can't even get them into knowing what's there. If you've got kids from a good high school, or think of the Chicago Children's Choir, every one of those kids can come into this thing and drink deeply because they've learned that language along the way, and I think we have to really work hard to bring it. I don't think I'd start with the B minor Mass, but I know there are a lot of kids in there, and I know some in that choir who are right at home with it because their soul is brought to it. In my planned remarks, I wanted to say, for me, this is the center of Bach's soul, and I've always been interested in that concept. My colleague at the University of Chicago, Leon Cass, once defined soul: the integrated vital power of any organic body, so long as it has possibility, purpose, and hope. Integrated, here you're the parody, you're bringing it all together, and yet it's an unum. Vital, boy, if it doesn't live, I don't know. Power, it bowls you over, even the softest parts, of any organic body, and I'm using as Cass says, the analogy of the human body. This is a shape. It holds together. And as long as it's open to purpose and possibility and hope. And to me, this is just the essence of what Bach is doing. I don't think we looked for all that when we were just singing it as if it were part of Sunday worship, only longer. I admire the people who did it back then. They know things that we don't know now, too.
Did you want to comment?
No, that's just, to me, such a perfect summing up of, say, another way of seeing the religious import of this magnificent piece of music, even aside, if we temporarily lay aside the actual text, the words, the Christian references, that wonderful definition of soul really does get an important point across about the kind of effect this music makes. So yes, it does have a religious import, even aside from the text, I would say.
What's interesting to me, as many of you know, John Nelson has taken Western music sometimes to China. And he showed me some of the translations. What are the Chinese getting from it? How lovely are thy dwelling place. Yeah. Well, this was done in a communist China when you weren't allowed to use anything God or divine. So what are you going to do? Well, first of all, they translated in Chinese, and the Chinese, they translated into English for the Westerners who are there. And I think that one is, here, happy individual says how nice it is some other place. Something like that. So, I have a copy of it. Well, John could show you all. It's really worth it to me. But something in that, the crowd, and think of how suddenly Western music of that sort, the great choral music has really taken over in Japan, China, and elsewhere, where it didn't have this long rootage. I'm always awed by the people who let the soul of it work on them.
Any other questions? I should clarify, in the subject language, the word parody is used commonly, but I need to just clarify that it has nothing to do with comedy. So parody, in the context that we use it, as you probably figured out, that when you talk about parody use in Bach, it literally means borrowing of previously existing material. So it is not parody in the humorous sense of the word. Just FYI on that.
There are not a lot of laughs in the B minor mass.
Wonderful.
I'm glad to say.
Yes. So failing of further other questions, may I again thank Professor Mark Peters, Professor Marty, Professor Jesse Rosenberg, and you, dear audience, for coming and sharing these moments. Thank you very much. May you have a wonderful experience, and you're invited back next Monday when we look at the performance questions surrounding this work, and then on Friday of that week, Friday the 11th of March, at the Harris Theater, John Nelson and the Chicago Bach Choir and Orchestra will be performing the Mass in B minor by Bach. Thank you so much. Good night.